just say a few quick words about it from my perspective as a cinematographer. I think that it's really an enhancement to the picture. It's much more than high frame rate or high resolution. It really makes a difference. For example, you can have two monitors side by side, and one could be HD and one could be 4K, and you really can't tell the difference unless they're giant, and that would be too big to have inside most people's homes or even in coloring suites. But you turn off the HDR and people will ask, hey, what happened to the picture? What's wrong? Fix that TV. But there's some problems with HDR. For one, there's no set system right now. There's Dolby's trying to get the industry to adopt their system, and they have a lot of money behind them, that they spend on the Dolby Theater and all that. That comes because they did that with, they pretty much monopolized the audio industry for a long time, and they get money from the facilities, they get money from licensing fees all the way down the line, and they want to do that with televisions too, from all the facilities, from the manufacturers of equipment, and down to the set-top boxes that deliver the material. Now, they do a really good job. They've done a great job with audio. They may be one of the only companies that has the clout to pull this kind of transition off. But maybe we don't want them to control. There's another system called HD10 or something like that. That was HDR10 that was set up by a broad coalition of companies in the industry. So maybe we ought to give that a chance. We should at least check it out. But I don't know much more about HDR, so I'm going to turn it over to the expert, Keith Roush. Keith is an award-winning senior colorist and the founder and CEO of Roush Media. It's a boutique DI house in Burbank. And tell us about HDR.
Sure. Well, as James was saying, that HDR, I think, is probably one of the biggest things that hit the image quality world, image fidelity, since at least since the transition from SD to HD. And hopefully most of you have had a chance to start to actually see that. We won't be able to show you any of that because without an actual HDR monitor, you can't actually see it. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a fundamental background to it, just so you can understand what it is. So I'm going to go a little deeper into that, hopefully. Okay. So I'm obviously with Roush Media. We are a DI facility in Burbank, as you said. I just actually finished a couple days ago a feature film graded through ACES, and then we took it into our HDR suite and looked at it with the DP. And his impression, literally, he was, no joke, jumping up and down and just ecstatic. He's never seen his images that way, and so it's 10 times more of an impact to the audience and to DPs and to colorists, to everybody, than image resolution alone. We'll talk a bit about that. So first, because I know all of you are in the industry, let's talk about the tools. This is our HDR grading suite we just installed newly in our facility. We're utilizing the Sony BVM X300 monitor. As you can see here, we have two monitors left side by side. We're a facility. We have a big DI theater with a 4K barcode projector on a 20-foot screen, and we've been doing digital intermediate for feature films for 15 years now. So, but nothing's got me more excited lately than HDR, honestly. And it's because I got 10 times the bigger canvas, 10 times the color volume than I've had before, and I'm going to tell you a little about that. But here in this particular suite, we have two monitors set up side by side. One is an older BVM monitor, so they're both grade 1 monitors, one's 709 and one's HDR. For the purpose of this thing, you can kind of see slowly, somewhat, that the HDR monitor is going to give you a lot more dynamic range, and we'll talk about what is dynamic range. Courtesy of Dolby here, this is an image that will help approximate that, where you'll see, if you were looking at this truly in HDR, a lot more detail in the highlights and still maintaining the shadows and just a nice tonal range there. And that's what HDR is. It's just a much more pleasant image to look at. And so Jody Elder is a good friend of mine. He shot this for Sony, and we've been utilizing it. We worked with it on for NAB last year. If you went to the NAB booth, you might have saw some of it. It was shot on the F55 in 4K RAW at 120 frames per second. And these are some of the images from that. So what I wanted to show you here is, and I'm only basically, what I've done here is this is an image that is essentially printed down so that all the luminance is there in 709, so you can see it on the monitors here. And you'll see that you're able to maintain all these specular highlights. We've been capturing HDR with our camera systems now since really the advent of negative film. We have just not been able to look at it because we didn't have any kind of monitoring that would be able to show us that amount of dynamic range. So if we were to then, and this is what colors have been doing since the beginning of time. This is why colors are so excited, because we were telesetting film. You would essentially window in into the top part of the image and see, maybe get the highlights, but you couldn't hold the shadows. Maybe you want to see the shadows, but you couldn't keep the highlights. Well, the HDR, now we can keep both. And this is not an HDR image, but it's a call. This is kind of mapping as best we can in standard dynamic range. But in HDR, you can actually really see those details of specular highlights if it was real, and you can see those shadow details in a deep way that are meaningful with a good tonal range and good contrast, and it's just phenomenal. So what makes that possible really is the monitoring. And so there are two, as you said, competing technologies out there. HDR10, more of a static metadata, even though that they are starting to add dynamic metadata to it. It's a little bit more of an open standard. And there's also Dolby Vision, which is more of a proprietary system from Dolby, which uses dynamic metadata. What I wanted to just give you some rough ideas here. What we've been seeing and what you can see in this projector and like that too is, maybe 1,000 to 1 or 2,500 to 1 contrast ratio on this projector. But in our monitor that we use for our mastering, it's literally arguably greater than 2001 because it emits almost a perfect zero black level. It's like 0.0005 or something like that at the OLED. And then, of course, it has a brightness level of 1,000 nits. So whereas we're talking about, it's all about light and how we can reproduce that onto their screens. So this projector, if it's DCI compliant, it's 48 nits, 14-foot Lamberts. And our standard dynamic range, X709, is 100 nits, but most of the stuff we're mastering for HDR now is 1,000 nits, even though the spec will allow us to go up to 10,000. So basically, like I said before, you can see here that the top is how we've been typically doing it, and we've been having to window down and squeeze that down into what you see on your typical monitors now. But HDR will allow us to move that pipe through the entire post process and maintain and keep that contrast ratio. Dynamic range, I just wanted to say this real quick, is the range between the smallest and the smallest values and the lightest values, the darkest blacks and the whitest brights. And that can be expressed in a series of f-stops or contrast ratios. So what makes a color space? Just as kind of, I know everybody's been throwing around this whole idea of color space for a long time. We hear it, but I just wanted to make sure we truly understood what that is. So these are the key factors that define what a color space is. The gamut, which is the entire range of colors, red, green, blue, chromaticity points. So that's the amount of volume of color. The gamma, or the transfer function, the EOTF, electrical optical transfer function, which is what we have a fancy name for the curve of it, which I can show you in a minute. So in standard dynamic range, X709, generally it's like a BT 1886 or 2.4 gamma, and then for HDR we use what they call the PQ curve or the hyperlog gamma. And then of course the white point, that's where the whitest white is on that particular display device. And then the luminance, how much of that do we got? Is it 1,000 nits, or is it 10,000 nits, or is it 1,000 nits, or 48 nits, or whatever that light is? So here that is represented. This is probably the coolest chart that you can see. If you were to take this left horseshoe diagram, which is a CIE chart, that's what's totally visible to the human viewer, our visible spectrum, so to speak, there. And then, of course, that smaller square is what we have as 709. That's in there. Now, let's say we were to take that horseshoe and lay it on its side, and then add luminance to it. That's the volume that you have there. And so that smaller little there, as you can see, is a 709, and HDR is up 10,000 nits there, and it would be at 1,000, a little bit, the line just less than that. And so understanding a little bit about what this is allows us to be able to utilize this bigger color space. And it's like a bigger canvas. I got more colors to paint with, I got more light to paint with, I got more contrast to use, and I can just, and sometimes that can be good, sometimes it can be bad. And case in point is, you're looking outside of a window, and you may not want to see that to realize that there could be people from your crew out there that you didn't realize were actually there in the image, but they're there. And we're grading in the theater, and then you go into the HDR suite and look at that and go, wow, look at all the stuff you can see out that window. That's bad.